And we are moving to our keynote presenter, Alan Smith, who is lab manager for the Area 404 at Facebook Hardware Prototyping Laboratory. He's also our symposium chair, and he will be speaking about 30 global work streams, designing return to office for Facebook in 6 weeks. Alan?
Thanks, Lesia. Yeah, so besides being the OCP symposium chair, my day job is as the Facebook Area 404 lab manager. We accelerate hardware development across Facebook, and we're responsible for running the infrastructure labs. And we actually have a global scope where we support all of the global hardware needs. We kind of augment the AR, VR stuff and the connectivity stuff. We have labs dedicated towards those two verticals of hardware. And then we focus primarily on the infrastructure stuff and step in across the company where needed. So yeah, today I'm going to talk about a sprint that we were leading across the company in 6 weeks, trying to figure out what was going on with the pandemic and how we were planning to get our folks back productively working in the offices and what scale we could do that. So there we go. This is what one of our labs looks like. We call this Short Circuit. It's in our Menlo Park Classic campus. A lot of our labs look like this. We want a standard environment as far as ESD, as far as network, as far as workbench. We want to have standard power interfaces. So this is what we thought that we were designing our return to office. We went to global work from home in March. And that was probably second week in March when we announced that. I'll have to go look that up. And about a week later, I messaged my boss and said, okay, what's the plan? You know, we're the first teams that are going to need to go back to work. The people that physically touch hardware are the ones most impacted by this COVID disruption and the work from home disruption. So how are we getting back to the lab? This is the problem that we thought we were solving. We soon came to find out that that was not the scope of the problem. So then we turned our attention towards our global sites. Okay, so all these are schematics of representative of a bunch of our lab sites. It's not all of them, ranging from Redmond, Washington, Los Angeles, California, Pittsburgh, Cork, Ireland, Zurich, and then our Menlo Park headquarters. The company wouldn't allow me to release exactly how many sites and exactly how many millions of square feet, but it's up there. So we were looking at thousands and thousands of hardware engineers we were designing return to office measures for. Nope, wrong again. So then we said, okay, maybe we're designing it for all the, oh, no, we're wrong again, huh? We actually were designing return to office for the entire company because we were the first ones to return to office. So the stuff that we were setting precedents for in the midst of even figuring out what was going on with this global pandemic, which safety measures were proving to be effective against this, which disinfectants had different impact on it. As the global community was learning about this, we were scaling a solution for 60,000 plus employees, 85 plus offices in 35 countries. Again, at least 30 work streams that we were broken into to figure out how to return the entire company back to work. And the first stage of that was our hardware engineers coming back into the labs. So this is how we organized. Again, each one of these boxes was a work stream. I have a partner, Matt Malfa, who leads the connectivity labs piece of it, the labs piece of that in Los Angeles. And then Jeff Fugate is our ops manager for infrastructure labs. We had to partner with global comms. We had to partner with supply chain. We had to figure out how to get security trained up. We had to figure out employment law and how do we do this in a non-discriminatory way. We had to coordinate through HR for all of those policies. And then we had to figure out how to operate within the labs, how to set prioritization. When we go back to that previous slide, each one of those dots represents a different municipality, a different government structure that has different rules about what the densities they were allowing people to come in. If you go back to March, you can remember that there were different spikes of these cases, so therefore the governments were kind of clamping down mobility in response to that. So we had to keep up with and keep in touch with each of those local communities. And I'll tell you, this isn't something that I imagined would go on my LinkedIn or on my resume when I joined Facebook a few years ago to do hardware prototyping and to stand up the labs. To figure out how to respond in a global pandemic environment is something that we're all doing here. One of the other things we had to do is we had to figure out and invent some technologies. So what I'm going to show you here is a robot that we call Mr. Clean. This is a UV scanning autonomous robot that goes through our lab spaces and swipes essentially each working station, each device with some UV light. We're in tests right now to understand the effectiveness of this. We're basically just running it as an experiment. To give you an idea of the talent that we have at Facebook, this robot, we adopted a previous platform that's one of our data center robotics platforms, integrated this light in, figured out the research and the papers. We had this thing built. This is a week after we even started the idea. We had this starting to run, including like SLAM mapping and all that stuff that we're doing here in the video. So I'll post some of this stuff in LinkedIn group afterwards so you can take a look. I know robotics are pretty interesting. Again, I just want to kind of focus on technologies are pretty simple to build when we're dealing with a global pandemic is what we're finding. This is an example of one of the harder problems we solved. How to get hardware to people's homes. Okay, so first we have to figure out the logistics of it, which that's kind of what I have on the screen here. The next thing is we have to figure out a bunch of safety and environmental things. So I'll just give you an example. We're shipping massive servers to people's homes. We're in infrastructure. We're shipping like lasers and stuff to people's homes, and we're thinking about optics and connectivity technologies, very high density energy. Even like something like soldering, you're having to think through stuff that's pretty natural. If I'm doing a home project, okay, I'm soldering, okay, there's a bit of like chemical waste that happens there. I have to think of my own ventilation. Now Facebook has to take responsibility as a globally incorporated company of the safety impacts of all those things. You know, what are the power environments? Are there kids that are going to walk by and get pinched by something? Are we discriminating against people by highlighting the risk of, oh, your kids might walk by, and we have to think of the liability there, which that was raised during this process. So the technologies that I presented on the previous slide are actually the easier things to try to put in place and assess. They're very straightforward problems. When we start getting into the people impacts of this, this is where our work is, I believe. And I'll kind of get into some lessons learned here. So there are three main takeaways I want to leave you all with, and I'm happy to take whatever questions you have. The first thing that we're learning at Facebook is we're solving for people. People are complex. People deal with stress in all different ways. It shows up in all different ways. A couple examples. So when we thought of what is the trigger of events if we do have a case or someone who tests positive that was on a site during a period where they could have been spreading that disease. Okay, so we thought through the contract tracing, we ran that by the consultants, we ran that up to HR, we ran it through EH&S. We had a process to deal with a confirmed case, how to deal with the cooling period, how to do contract tracing, all of that. We outlined a process. It was bought off by a bunch of different consulting companies. The thing that we didn't account for at the outset is, what about the rumor mill? Oh, I heard such and such might have come down with the case. Oh, okay, so now we got to go solve for that. Now we have to put in place expectations, not only of the members of saying, hey, you have to be responsible. These things might be HIPAA, it might be personal information to people, but also there's a management responsibility to set expectations about how to operate and where to elevate concerns. So we had to set up those channels and teach people the difference between a confirmed case, which we kind of understood the events that fall out from that, from what happens when we suspect that there's a case, when someone's coughing, or we hear something about someone that they might have gotten sick. So solving for people, again, it's complex. And the biggest thing that we're learning is the stress that people are feeling, the uncertainty, and the fear that's kind of inherent in some of this stuff because of all the uncertainty just manifests in people in different ways. This kind of leads to the next point. So if you hear anything, please hear this. The biggest thing we're learning at Facebook is it only helps to have empathy. So to not treat it as someone's ill intention if they skip one of the cleaning procedures we put up, or the login signs so we can make sure that we're not tripping occupancy caps set by the local governments. Treating that as this is all new. I haven't been at the office in a number of weeks. It's a miracle I even found my badge, right? Forgive me if I missed a step of taking a temperature check or reading through a pre-screen or checking myself in and out manually from a lab. Like, this stuff is all going to be new, so having empathy when we're approaching it. Again, there's so much fear baked in this, so a lot of the response that we saw was people kind of going, you're making me feel unsafe with your behavior. Hey, you need to wear your mask in this way. And we kind of had to train a lot of people, and we just had to really instill in everybody, take a deep breath. Everyone's adapting to this. Everyone's afraid. We all are trying to figure this out together, so let's try to be in this together. This is my last point, and then we'll open it up for Q&A. I have a very specific word in this statement. The impact from COVID-19 times should be permanent. And I want to take a moment to just settle on that word should. We at Facebook are not thinking about how to go back to the way things were. I love kind of what David and Tian and Arvind talked about. We're trying to figure out the best practices we're learning in this forced remote environment to figure out how to enable a whole new type of work. I'm really encouraged by the poll that we just showed, where everyone is kind of seeing that same thing, that there's some people going, yeah, I could do my job completely from remote. I don't need to be at an office at all because I can be more productive because I'm not in a car X number of minutes or hours per day. I can be near my family, so I'm a little more satisfied. I can cook more meals, personally speaking. So the biggest thing we're doing at Facebook is we're making a bunch of investments starting right now. We led an organization-wide sprint in hardware engineering to say, what are the technologies that enable a future of optional remote work or hybrid work? We're starting to think about all the talent pipelines we're going to be able to access. I mean, I think Tian mentioned doing research with people around the world and having to figure out the logistics around that. Well, now we're having to think about how to design and ship systems in very, very tight timeframes with near impossible physics on some of these things, like co-packaged optics we're trying to figure out at Facebook. Now we're trying to figure out how do we bring in the world's best talent, not only people who will come to the Bay Area or our Austin office or one of our sites, but how to enable all sorts of calendars, all sorts of working arrangements, and all new types of people who just don't want to come to one of those big density cities, wants to work from their home for whatever reason. So we're really investing very rapidly on figuring out how to remote access network-based PDUs, for example, power distribution units. One of the #1 things that we do when we touch devices in the labs is power cycle them. We connect cables in. We turn dials on signal integrity switches or scopes or something. So we're trying to figure out how to enable, through a network environment, how to virtually connect and run a fiber optic cable from your device in your home, wherever you're at, all the way into a lab through all the security protocols and be able to control that device. So that's my encouragement to all of you is, definitely please focus on the empathy. Please just be kind to one another as we're all figuring this out and navigating the fear. But the biggest thing is I'm encouraging us to figure out how to take these lessons learned and create and enable a whole new generation of talent to join us in this industry. All right, I'll end that talk here, Lesia or Dirk. Do you want to take some questions in?
Yes, Alan, thank you. Great discussion. So we did have 2 questions that were sent in. So the first one is, can you talk a little bit about the change in productivity, specifically when moving to work from home, and then the expected productivity as you transition to potentially a hybrid model with any precautions?
Yeah, I think we're figuring that out right now. So for those that are familiar, Zuck was one of the first leaders to kind of announce when we went back in March, I think it was 2 or 3 weeks after we announced a mandatory global work from home, was that we took our expectations for performance off the table in the first half. We're rated every half on how we perform. So in the second half, we're starting to ramp back up. We are just hitting a mid-cycle. And so I'm seeing a lot of managers and leaders try to figure that out in real time about how to just get enough cross signal of what disruption are you experiencing and how to compare that to the disruption I'm experiencing. What I will tell you is the expectation of leadership is we've got to continue to ship. And this is why, Dirk. there are global elections and global information exchange happening on our platforms. We have a responsibility that we've learned over the last 4 years that we play a role, Facebook platforms, Instagram, WhatsApp, Messenger, and Big Blue Facebook app, on how information is propagated. And now we're adding this with there's a global pandemic and information around what is true and not true around vaccines and therapeutics and et cetera. So the needs of the business are only continuing to go like that. One of the biggest tests for us at Facebook is we're landing 2 application-specific integrated circuits this half. Brand new taped out chips of novel silicon in our fleet for the first time. We're starting to receive those first units this half. So we have to stay on track because our global community demands it. To answer your question, time will tell. We will see. We are definitely trying to go in with a very empathetic understanding of people are experiencing disruption in different ways, whether this used to be my daughter's school environment. I've changed offices 4 times in my home. Dirk has seen me on some calls where we've been in the garage, I've been in the trailer, I've been out on the deck enjoying the sunshine, and I've been back in my office here, and I'm thankful to be that. So what we're asking Dirk to respond to this is individual empathy for each member, for them to voice how the disruption is hitting them and to set the expectations with their partners. Here's what I'm capable of doing, and here's where I'm going to start to get stressed out. We're asking managers and leaders to then voice that and bring into the solution space, how do we solve those disruption problems? Not put it on the individual member of the person doing signal validation on a new chip or signal verification or test. We are trying to figure out globally across a bunch of managers and leaders, how do we figure out how to work around this, set expectations, lean on our vendors, partner with our vendors, etc.
Okay, perfect. And so we've got 2 more minutes before the 10-minute break that we're going to take right after this. But one last question. So what kind of ongoing internal training does Facebook offer, and has that transferred to the remote workforce? So specifically about training.
Training, so yeah, we did launch a few training. We tried to do them kind of video based. They can be asynchronously taken. So one is like a visual walkthrough of what the new protocols are going to be like. And then we have a bunch of wikis and stuff like that stood up that are referenced, and they're meant to be reviewed before people go. We're asking managers to follow up with individual members who will be on site afterwards to say, hey, how can we improve this process as we're all learning together here? And then what we're trying to do is we're trying to create a lot of collaboration environments where we bring in a bunch of ideas and say, how do we just start trying some things? Because we Facebook are not thinking that January 1st we're going back to the labs in scale. We're not thinking June 1st we're going back to the labs in scale. We are preparing for a future that is permanently disrupted, as I talked about earlier in my talk. So we are constantly trying to figure out how to evolve the nature in which we work, rather than be like, I'm scraping to the finish line of when you let me go back into the labs and finally do the work the way they used to. We're going, don't think that way, team. We need to think differently here. So maybe it's not training, it's more about creating the environments and forums where people can voice and say, these are best practices here for me.
Okay, great. Great answers and great discussion. Thank you very much. So we're going to take our break.